Good to see everybody. It's not often we get to see this many people at the same time right now, so it's nice to see some friendly faces. And I just wanted to say, first off, just a couple of things. One is that unlike if we were doing this in person, we're not really going to have interactive exercises just because of the amount of time. We could have done this as a 3-hour and tried that or something, but that's a really long time for people to be looking at their screen and paying attention to all this. So we're going to go through, but I do want to stress, please do ask any and all questions that you want to ask as we go through. That will really make this a better presentation, and it'll allow me to really focus on what you all need. So if you could please do that, I'd really appreciate it. And as Jeanette said, there's the little chat bubble at the bottom of your video screen that you can click on and type a note there if you want to ask a question. We're not going to be taking any breaks, of course. I'm trusting you that you'll do that when you need to. And one thing I want to make clear is that just in case it wasn't in emails and things that you received, is that this is a presentation that AMY Foundation wanted to be made, but it's not focusing just on applying to AMY. They really wanted to give you all an opportunity to get some grant writing assistance and training. And one of the reasons for that, I'll just say at the very beginning, is that there were a lot of avoidable mistakes on the applications that AMY has received so far. And so there's a lot of things I'm going to talk about today that, although it's not just talking about AMY Foundation, it's going to be information that you can use when applying to AMY. And also it's going to be information you could use really in applying for any grant. So it's a beautiful day to talk about grant writing. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen here with you. Okay, so please forgive in advance my sappy food puns and metaphors from this presentation. But we're going to talk about just preparing grants from scratch. Maybe it's not super easy, but it is straightforward, and it is something that anyone can learn to do. And there's some fundamentals that are important to know, but beyond that, just exercising these principles that we're going to talk about and just getting some practice will really help you write a stronger proposal. So to start off, just a taste of what to expect as you're starting with your grant writing. We found as an agency that even with the amount of experience that we've got, I've been doing this for more than 25 years now, and I've got some people on my team who've been doing this even longer. And even with the experience that we have, with established organizations that we're writing for, we usually get about 60% to 85% success rate, just kind of depending on the situation and the applications. For groups that's for groups that are more established. They've been around for a while, they've gotten some grants and so forth. And then when we write for newer organizations that have less experience preparing themselves to put forth grants, or they're brand new organizations and don't have a lot of relationships, we've still found that we're very able to get grants. And our average is usually more up around like mid 40% or something like that. But usually we find with newer groups, there's some that do better than others depending on how close they are to serving basic needs. But it's still about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. And so all of this is just to say that, one, that you can't win them all, so you're going to get rejections no matter how long you've done this or how good you are at it or how good your organization is. and it's not necessarily a reflection on any of that. But as you can see with, you know, the top stats, we do usually get more like a 65 or 70% or so average regularly with groups that have experience. And so if you do follow these steps, then you're going to get to the point to where you're successful with your applications. But just, you know that especially right now, it's a competitive time, and you just really have to put your best foot forward each time. And the other thing that these stats tell you is that you want to apply for, you know, if you can, to more than one place for what you need, because the chances are is that you're going to have some successes and then you're going to have some turndowns, and that's totally fine. Foundations and other grant makers expect you to go to other folks for the same money, as long as you're not obviously double dipping and spending different grants on the same thing when you're reporting back and so forth. You're okay with that. So we use this system for grant writing, and we're only going to be focusing today primarily on writing a grant proposal and preparing to write, basically doing the planning and doing your case for grant writing. But I wanted to take you around this whole system that we use, just so you're aware of the big picture and where you would place what we're going to discuss today inside a larger context. So I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but we're looking at the right upper hand box where it says start to begin with. And so one thing that's very important with grant writing, and you know what, and before I dive into this, actually, Jeanette, there were a couple polls that I was going to do, and I'm sorry, I just kind of dove right past it. But before I go into this, I wanted to learn a little bit more about you all. And so Jeanette's going to pose a couple questions that will help me as I go around this.
Great. I will launch the first poll, Mark, right now.
Thank you.
Can everybody see that poll?
Mm-hmm.
Good. All right, I think we have everybody. I'm going to end the polling and share the results.
Great, so thanks so much. So, you know, I'm seeing that most of you are relatively new at this, although there are some folks on the line who have a whole lot of experience. And also, you know, not very surprisingly, in our area, we've got a lot of folks who are in smaller size organizations, but also some from larger as well. So thanks for sharing that. And I am going to cover a lot of fundamentals, but what I found is that even more experienced grant writers can sometimes benefit from this information, because most grant writers have not gone to grant writer school. There's some degree programs now, but when I started and even now, most people that I run into who do grant writing haven't really had any formal training and have had to just learn from those around them and from doing. And so hopefully this will give some grounding no matter what stage you're at, that you can use yourself or share with others who have less experience. So going back to this, so I created this so that folks who are not as accustomed to grant writing have a better sense of what the process entails and where they're at. And so this first piece in the top right here that I call invest, It's important that you've got leadership support behind your fundraising and your organization. And so it's important that leadership is supporting your efforts and understands that they have a role to play in supporting the application. There are key times when management comes in and can play a key role. And in some cases, you all who are participating are the organization, I know, because there's a lot of you that indicated you have fewer than a couple of employees. But whether it's a large or small organization, it's important to have that buy-in and to have whoever's in charge recognize that fundraising takes time and it takes support, and it's not just a one-person job unless you're just that one-person organization. And even then, you have a board, and so there are other folks who you might call upon to help out. Just to give you a quick example of where that can make a difference or where that can help, one example that I use sometimes is a meeting that I was with the CEO of a local hospital, and he was with the fundraisers and with the person from a foundation that provides large capital grants. And at one point in the meeting, the person from the foundation said, if we give you this grant, will you follow through with this project and raise the rest of the funding? Is this going to be a priority for you? And without missing a beat, he said, yes, we're going to do this. If you don't, if we can't raise the other money, we're going to follow through with this project. And so I've been in rooms sometimes where it didn't go that way, and the CEO was not as focused on what was being discussed, and and didn't jump right in, and provide that kind of emphasis on that the grant was going to be used and used in the right way and so forth. So that's an example of where that can come into play. This assess step we're going to talk some about, and basically it's before you start doing the proposal writing, having a really laser sharp focus on the problem that you're trying to address. So grants really run on solving challenges. And so you have to be very, very clear on what it is you're trying to solve. And we'll say more about that. And then you also have to have a very clear strategy that you can present to funders about how you're going to solve the problem. Moving on, once you have those needs and strategies, you have to put them together into a case that you can make to foundations, and this applies to donors as well. But what I would compare it to is sort of a business plan for your particular project. And so you're asking folks who are funders to make an investment in what you are doing. And you're basically saying, there's this problem in our community. With your funding and your investment, we are the right organization to solve this problem, or at least to address it. And I'm putting some emphasis on this because this was one area that Nora Frank from the foundation, this is one area where she emphasized that that some folks in their proposals have put an emphasis on how much their organizations are in trouble or need to raise funds to survive and so forth. And so that's, that's not something that foundations respond to, because, and they think of it as an investment. And so, for instance, if you are proposing to start a new business, and well, let's say your cousin Louie is going to start a new business and comes to you and says, hey, Francis or Joe, I want you to put $50,000 into this business, and I'm sure it'll work. You know, I'm going to give it my best and so forth. You know, you might, depends what Louie's like, but you might not just jump in, you know, and give your $50,000. But if you know, if Louie comes and says, hey, I'm starting this new project and I've got Warren Buffett's putting in $10,000 and Bill Gates is putting in 10,000 and these other people are contributing to it, then suddenly it sounds a little more interesting, right? And so, you know, what foundations are looking for is they're looking for a strong organization that is stable and is going to successfully help to solve this problem or to solve this challenge. So you see the difference there in that, you know, you're not asking for a handout, you're asking for a commitment and an investment from this particular foundation. In return, just as you know, if you're going for a business loan or something like that, they want to know that you're going to be able to pay off on this investment. And you're not paying them back in money, of course, you're paying them back in helping to address this social issue. And so I just want to be very clear on that, since I know that's something that Nora saw in a lot of proposals, and it's a common mistake for people to make starting out. It's something that a lot of people do when they're just starting. So moving on here down to prospecting, and I will go back, by the way, and we'll go through all the steps in terms of, we'll go through all the pieces of your case and your proposal and what you want in there as we go on here. But just moving around here, so the prospecting piece, of course, is important. Is that if you're going to AMY or to any other foundation, you want to make sure that you're a good match. And competition is such right now, and usually at all times, but especially right now with all the needs that are out there, is that it can't just be sort of a good match. It's got to really be a strong match. And so you have to make the case. You know, you're not just answering the questions that they are posing to you, but you're making the case and answering those questions sort of like an attorney would, or somebody who's, you know, anyone who's defending a cause. You have to basically, you know, basically argue in those answers that what you're doing is so important and is so in line with what they're doing. And if what you're doing truly is not aligned, then it might not be worth the time to go to that foundation. You might want to talk to someone at that foundation and see whether or not it would be worthwhile to apply. Moving around here, so to number 5, what I call cultivate here is building relationships. And it doesn't mean that you have to be really connected. You know, it doesn't mean that you have to know someone really well at the foundation. I would say that something like 90 or 95% of the grants that we help clients to get, they don't have any connection whatsoever with the foundation. Much more often, it's just putting your best foot forward, starting to build a relationship with the program officer, and just showing that you're a capable person and you're a capable organization. And what we do also very well is we vet the funders, and we try to make sure by having conversations with funders. Sometimes it's an inquiry letter that you're sending and you can't talk to them. Other times you can call or exchange emails, but we try to basically limit the time that we waste on, you know, I'll say it in a better way. We try to limit the time that we spend on grant applications to the ones we can really get, you know. And so you want to be looking at what the foundation criteria is and what their guidelines are, and making that decision of, is it worthwhile for me to spend at least 2 or 3 solid days of writing this application, or is this just too much of a long shot and I should look elsewhere? Number 6 is for propose. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg sort of thing, is that there's all this work that you do to get to the place of proposing. And so you should be coming up with the plan first. You should have a plan in mind. before you even talk to a funder. You want to know what you want to ask for, and they basically expect you to have that sense, you know, so you don't want to be calling a funder and just kind of shooting the breeze and talking generally about what you do. You really want to have something in mind, and usually more than one something that you might want to propose or ask for, and you have to be really prepared to present that in a short amount of time, and then to follow through with any requests that they make, such as, you know, sometimes when you talk to someone at a foundation, they'll say, "This sounds great. Can you send me a one-page explanation of this," or something in writing so I'll understand it better and be able to share it. And so often before we even reach out to foundations, we'll have a one-pager prepared or something kind of sketched out so that we have a fair sense of what it is we want to say to a funder and what it is that we would send over if they ask for more detail. Going on to number 7 here, and I'm just going to touch on these pieces that happen after you make the grant, you get the grant, is, you know, obviously when you get the grant, you want to sincerely thank the folks who are giving it to you. But the other thing that we do is we work with folks who are implementing. And again, for some of you, you're the implementer and the fundraiser and the director. But if it's not you who's doing this, then you have to sit down with the folks who are doing it on your team and make sure that they understand what it is that's been promised in the proposal and what it is that they're meant to do, and then be following up with them during the course of the project to make sure that it's on track. You're also, you know, one thing that also that grant makers really value is evaluation, moving on to number 8 here. And so there's a lot of funders that they value evaluation about, you know, that to a large, you know, not quite as large of an extent as following through and doing a good job with the money that you've been given. But for a lot of foundations, if your evaluation shows that the project didn't succeed, but that you learned a lot in the process and you did what you had planned to do and it just didn't work, most funders are completely fine with that. You know, they just want to know that you put your best effort into it, and they want to know that you know, that you did try to implement this plan, and that if it didn't work, that hopefully at least you've learned some lessons from it so that it'll work the next time. And this is information that funders can use so that they can share it with other folks that they give grants to, so that they don't repeat the mistakes that, you know, perhaps you ran into during your project. So don't be afraid to share some of those challenges in speaking with them, and what you, as long as you can also explain, you know, what follows and what you can learn from that. In the reporting, you want to always report back to foundations, and I think most of you know that they at least usually want to report at the end of 1 year, if not more frequently. Another thing that I'll mention, though, that I think we don't do quite enough as nonprofits is, you know, I know when I was on staff at organizations, some of the organizations I was with, we would get a grant and then we do a press release that we got the grant, but we didn't always do as good a job of, at the end of the grant period, saying, hey, we did it, you know, and here's what happened, and here's what we learned, and kind of sharing those stories. And I know you all have a lot of great stories to tell, and so you want to share those and sort of track those as you're going through the grant period. And then this last piece here before moving on is I call sustain, and that's just to say that if you're an organization that's telling the same story again and again, that every once in a while you have to look back at the challenges that you're addressing in the community and how you're solving them, and ask yourself, is this something that's still effective? And is this something that's still current? Or are there better ways to do this? And this is something that especially becomes important after you have initial success with grants, because we work with a lot of organizations that are fairly new or that haven't gotten a lot of grants before, and what we often see is that we'll have a lot of success for the first year and a half or so, and the project will get built up and built up. And then suddenly, if there's nothing there to sort of continue that momentum, it starts to lose interest on the part of foundations, because they've heard the same story already from you, a couple of times, and they want to know, okay, what's the next step here, or what's the next new thing that you're doing? So grants they're best for starting projects or expanding projects. They usually don't continue, and so most grant makers that you're looking for are going to be looking to help you to do something that's not being done right now, and that you're building on work that you've done in the past. And so you want to be careful in presenting to show to most foundations that this is something that's really going to not just continue an existing service, but really build on it if you can. If you really don't want to build on it, it doesn't make sense for you to build on it, then you'll have to make sure that the funder will fund those types of continuing efforts before you apply, and that's usually a conversation to have with the funder. So I just dropped a whole lot of information right there on the process that we use. So please do ask questions if any of this is not making sense, or if it's raising some questions for you, and I'll just ask Jeanette to cut in and interrupt me if she sees that folks are asking, and I'd be happy to address those. So moving on with the presentation then. So we're going to talk a lot about preparing the grant application, and this is where we're going to live for a lot of this webinar today. And so in getting started, we'll go into someone's in the kitchen here. So just to emphasize this, grant writing is really a team effort, and just recognize that if you're writing a grant, if you haven't recognized this already, or if those around you haven't recognized it already, you're not just a good writer. And I think when people look for someone to write their grants, that's often what they're looking for, is they're looking for someone who's this great writer, and is going to come in and it's going to be sort of a silver bullet and is going to get this grant. And really that's, I know from doing this for as long as I have that that's not enough. It certainly helps to be a good writer, and it helps to use spell check before you send something to the foundation to make sure it looks neat and that kind of thing. But the most important thing is that you've got a good plan. And so sometimes as a grant writer, you're going to find yourself wearing that hat where you really have to plan, and either yourself or with your team are going to have to make some executive decisions as to what you want to do and what the problem is that you want to address. Sometimes you have to be a diplomat and a cheerleader to get the information that you need from folks. Sometimes if you're your own shop, it's a lot of time to take to gather the data that might be needed for a proposal. And if you're in a larger shop, then it's sometimes really hard to get information that you need from folks. But one of the most important pieces of grant writing to me is that you have to be really persistent, and you have to have a picture in your head of, here's the information that we're going to need in this application to put our strongest foot forward. And then I use, with people that I work with to get information, I use what I call polite persistence. And I often will ask them to give me a reasonable deadline of when they can complete something. And then if I don't get what I need by that time, then I'll go back, preferably that day, the first day past that deadline, and say, this is important. We can't really have a strong case to get these funds and to solve the problems we're trying to solve unless I get that. So I'll get off my soapbox on that, but just know that you're wearing many, many hats in grant writing, and you want people around you to understand that, so that they know that it's not just them handing something to you to write, but that you really need help putting this together and having a plan. And that holds true whether it's just you as the one staff member and you've got a board, or whether you're in an organization that has hundreds of employees. So what are you serving up? So the most important part of the proposal is the needs section. And I say that not because it necessarily gets the most points for you on the proposal, but I say that because if you think about it, it has to be true. So let's say that you don't really define what the problem is and it's not compelling. You know, if that's the case, then it's not going to really inspire grant makers to give you funds. Also, if you talk about the need incorrectly, or if you sort of frame your case incorrectly by pointing to a need that isn't really the core need that you're getting to, then everything else in the proposal is going to be wrong when you think about it, because if you're not really focused on the correct problem, then it's impossible to describe a solution to that problem that's going to really be a true solution. And so I often will spend the most time putting together a really solid plan for what we're going to say the challenges that we most want to address. And I'll give you some tips about that as we go forward. So one thing that I use and that I share with others to use is this checklist. And so it's need statements. They're a lot slipperier than what they seem when you first sit down to write them. It's harder than you would think to really focus in sometimes on the problem, the exact problem that you're trying to solve. And so I use this checklist to make sure that it's a strong need statement. And so you can measure your need statement that you're going to write against this checklist. And to say just a little bit more about what I mean when I say a needs statement, just in case you're very new in that way, is that funders are looking for a very concise explanation of the big problem that you're trying to solve in the community. And sometimes when folks are new, they'll focus on something like poverty as a problem. And unless your organization is specifically designed to change poverty and is doing nothing else, that's part of the story, and you want to share that the folks you're serving, that's something that they're up against. But the problem that you present is one that you have to solve with this grant money, or at least have to address. And so if you're not measurably going to address poverty by the end of this project, then it's something you should list as supporting evidence, but it's not the main problem. And so hopefully that explains a little bit more about what I mean. Please pose questions if I'm not being as clear, or if you want more on that. But the point there is that it's got to be a problem that you can solve. So going through the checklist here, so it's the need, it should be something that's outside of your organization. And this is another common problem that I see with beginning grant writers when I'm reviewing their grant, is that the foundation wants to know how your organization is affected, but it mostly wants to know how the people out in your community are affected. And so when you're talking about problems to solve, you're not talking about the lack of a staff person or the lack of a piece of equipment. Those are your solutions. Your solution could be getting a new staff person or a piece of equipment. But the problem is that there's people in your community who are hungry, or who don't have housing, or who don't have adequate health care. And so those are the problems that you need to focus on. It's not unacceptable, especially if you're asking for funds to build capacity in your organization. It's not unacceptable to talk about your organization, but that should always be more of an afterthought than the clients. And it should always relate back to how you're going to solve this problem. Okay, please ask questions if you do want to know more about that. Going on to the next one, remarkably impactful. You want to make sure that it's clear to the person who's reading this why this is so important and why this has to happen now. And you have to imagine that in your mind. I often, imagine that a lot of the funders that I go to, unless they're if they're funding something, especially if they're a family foundation or if they're one like AMY that funds a lot of things like food banks and that sort of thing. This is basically what they're having to decide between at this point with foundations is, do we give funds for food or healthcare or for what you're proposing? And so if you are not meeting a basic need, it's a little harder, but you still have to make the case of, why this is so important and why it's timely and important right now. And so if you're one of the folks on the call who are more experienced grant writer, you'll know after a while you start to really, sometimes you're writing a proposal and you just think, even I'm not convinced by this. This isn't really compelling to me, and it's not really saying what I want it to say. And when that happens, most of the time it's because you're not really focusing in on the most important piece that you should be talking about in terms of the problem that you're trying to solve. And so trust your gut, and if the need doesn't sound compelling enough, then build on it and make it stronger and more direct. One thing that I often see, and if we were doing exercises, we would do some sort of lab work and sort of play this out, but one thing that I often see is when people take their first stab at the need statement, especially if they're not that experienced with it, it'll be very vague. And if you have someone read it, they'll say, well, I kind of know what you're talking about, but it doesn't really move my heart. It's not something that really compels me. And so what you find is the deeper you dig into thinking about it and the deeper you dig into describing it, I often, data is great. It's also good to have some stories from clients. So you have to really be writing this so that you're using the data and or stories that, you want people to cry when they're done reading this. You want them to really feel like, oh, this is horrible and I need to help do something about it. That's the goal of this section. It's not to talk about how you're going to solve the problem. The need statement is only about describing what the challenge is. So moving on from that, measurable and objectively documentable. A lot of foundations will say you need to be able to measure the solution and provide a measurable outcome, but I will take that a step further and I will argue that the need that you're talking about also has to be measurable and documentable. And so you need a baseline of where the challenge is right now and how you're going to go about solving that challenge, right? And so you need a starting point. And so it has to be measurable to the extent that you can say, here's the problem, and by the end of this, either for these individuals that we're serving, or for these animals that we're serving, or for this community that we're serving, that we'll be able to show you that they're in a better place than they were at the very start. Okay, and so that's how specific you really have to be with it is, this is the exact problem, and here's where we're at right now with it. Needs are best when they're universal and they're indisputable, and all I mean by that is what you all do, it's all providing a great service to the community, and these services, except for in very isolated cases, it doesn't really matter if the person you're helping is liberal or conservative or or black or white. It just matters that you're providing this very important service. And so when you're writing this, try to remove all bias from your language. Don't try to, to be guessing at this person who's looking at this is going to come at it from this particular viewpoint or this particular politics. But make sure it's something that anybody can read and anyone can relate to, unless it's just very core to your organization that you share a certain perspective. Going down to this fifth bullet here about not a lack of products or services. So, I'll just say again, because this is such a common mistake that I see, is that that your need, and it's tricky if you're in education, say, I mean, the need is not a lack of a product or a service or a staff person. And so for instance, if you're doing a education proposal, the problem isn't that people don't have your classes, and the problem isn't that you don't have enough instructors or something like that, right? The problem is that people need certain knowledge to get a certification, or they need to be educated and get their degree, and that's really the challenge, is that they're trying to advance themselves. And you can show in that kind of needs section, here's the challenges that folks in my community are facing. And here, here are the situations that, here's where they need to get to this next step in their development. So it might be a certification or something. But at this point, you're not talking about that solution. You're just talking about, here's the problem. For instance, people are not upwardly mobile enough economically in our community. And then you can talk about that whole problem. And then when you get to the solutions, you could say, well, here's the strategy that we're presenting. We're going to give them these classes, or we're going to allow them to receive the certification or something like that. So, so that's a big one, is that you're not even talking about the solution in this part of the proposal when you're talking about needs. Aligning with organization missions, whatever you're proposing, you want to show that you're the right organization to do it. And so all of the explanation that you're doing up through the needs piece and the whole proposal, it should be basically building the case, sort of reading between the lines, that there's a solution that's needed, and the solution you're working up to should be one that your organization was built to provide. And so you just want to make sure that everything's in alignment there. So before I move on from the needs, Jeanette, has anyone posed any questions yet that we should address? Or?
No, there are no questions in the chat as of right now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I must be doing perfectly. If anyone does have questions, please do just type them in at any time, even if it's something that we've passed. That's okay. I wanted to say before I go there, I wanted to go to this one. So we're still at this point, if going back to just that wheel that I showed you, that full color slide, and you'll get a copy of this later. What I had said was that, first you've got the investment of your team, and then you've got coming up with needs and strategies, right? And so we've just talked about the needs. And so the strategies, it's sort of a yin-yang sort of thing, that you want to have this very specific problem that you're talking about, and then after that, you want to have the solution. And so typically what you're looking for in a strategy is that it's a lever that you're going to use to solve this problem. So it's typically long-term. It's not a goal or a task or an outcome or any of those other words that funders use. They don't often say, what is your strategy? But you still have to have one, which is sort of your overarching solution. And so in the example that I just gave, for instance, on education, education might be the strategy to address people's lack of upward economic mobility. You might decide that by providing a certification to get people training to fix HVAC or to do some other sort of service, that they're going to be able to earn a higher salary. And this is sort of my big picture solution. So, so make sure that you're implementing the best strategy, excuse me, that you can, and that it's something that you can show is a proven strategy that is likely to get people to where they need to go. So to continue down this list here, the strategies, they often require leadership decisions. And I want to just say, this is one of the hardest things about grant writing, and I think it's often overlooked. But when you're writing a grant proposal, sometimes it's difficult to work together as a team and to come up with a plan because there's a lot at stake, right? Because you're making some big decisions about how you're going to spend this money and what your organization is going to be doing if it gets this grant. And so there's often decisions that if you're the leader, you're going to need to be making some firm decisions. And if the leadership is shared, you're going to have to be sharing this with others and asking them questions like, how many people are we promising to serve with this grant? And is that too many people? And do we want to focus the funds in this direction that we're going in as an organization or in another direction? And so just know that the reason that this requires strategic planning in a way up front when you're doing a grant proposal is because there's some big decisions to be made like that. And it's hard to make those decisions when the deadline's a week away, right? And so, so these are decisions that as an organization, you want to be making hopefully before the proposal even comes around, is just coming up with, when we do have grant opportunities, what is it that we want to focus on, and what are we going to apply for, so that when you get to the point of having a deadline, that that you're ready, right? You've got a plan and you've got a starting point. Now, I would be dishonest if I said that the grants we do, we always have this wonderful plan and we always start weeks before the deadline. That often does not happen. But the organizations and the projects where we have a more thought out plan are the ones that are going to make the strongest proposals. And so even if your deadline is a week or so away, you still want to be thinking through your case before you sit down and start writing, and try to be as specific as you can about what you want to accomplish before you start really working on that proposal. Be very specific about the need and about the strategy. I'll go into this again once more in this presentation, but I get a lot of questions about what's the difference between objectives and outcomes, and how do I use these in proposals? There's funders that use words interchangeably sometimes, so I'm just going to give you some definitions that you can use just to have a sense of what funders are looking for. And it doesn't really matter the wording that funders use, because you're going to be presenting the same information to just about any funder you go to, and you'll see this as we go through in a moment, the parts of the proposal. But usually what's most important to funders is this piece that's the third one, is the outcomes. They usually most want to know, what is the measurable way in which people are going to be better off? And I'll explain how that's a little different from the ways that you might now be answering this question. So goals, usually when you're talking about a goal, it's a broad aim that may never be achieved. And so, for instance, if you're a food bank, the goal might be that no one ever goes hungry. And you're probably never going to achieve that anytime soon. But that tells people what you're trying to accomplish, right? That's your big goal. Objectives are measurable aims. And so with objectives, usually you're counting something. So you're saying, we're going to serve 45 people and we're going to provide 10 classes, and the classes are going to be 3 hours a week and so forth. So objectives are the counting part, the quantitative part, and then the outcomes, and this is the piece that foundations really tend to care the most about. This is the qualitative, the quality of life. And so this is the piece that more than anything else you want to have in your proposal. You want to be able to say an outcome, and an outcome basically is, it has to do with how people's lives are going to be better after this project. And so you need some measure in there that shows, so the person that I'm serving starts at point A, and by the time they get to point B or C or D, at the end of the project, here's how I'll know that their lives are better. And there's many, many ways you could do that. It could mean that, you know, if you're a mental health provider, it could be that they're feeling less anxious by the end of the project and you're doing a survey or something like that, or some other well-documented test that you do. It could be that you're showing that they miss fewer meals if you're, you know, a food pantry or something like that. It could be that their income has increased, or that they have a new job that's going to help them get to this place. And so there's many ways that you can demonstrate that, but you want to have an outcome to where the average person who's looking at your proposal can look at it and say, yes, this makes sense to me. I can see how at the end of this project, this person is going to be better off. Okay, so that's the most important thing, is you're basically showing and stating how the world is going to be a better place after this project, and that should be really evident to the person reading it. And then tasks are just sort of your short-term to-dos. So it might be putting out an ad that lets people know that your service is available, or it could be hiring someone during the project, but it's basically just a to-do on your list. And so you want to be focused on outcomes when you're writing up your proposal. So moving on to the recipe. And so when I say the recipe, so these are elements that you want in every grant proposal that you're going to put together. And one of the tricky things about writing grant proposals is that different funders ask you different types of questions. But what I want to get across to you today is that no matter which questions are asked, if you include all of these elements somewhere in the proposal, you'll be okay. And so these are the core elements. And so I'm going to just take you through these briefly. And again, you'll get copies of all these slides, and you'll get, we're recording this too, so you'll be able to go back if I'm going kind of quickly on some of this. So contact information, you would think that I wouldn't have to say this, but I know that I do, because I still hear from funders that sometimes they get proposals that don't have adequate information that they can actually contact the organization. And so if they don't specifically ask for it, make sure you have all of your information on there, and make sure it's on a phone number that somebody's answering and that the person answering it is responsive. And so you want to make sure that all that's in there. I put the website on here because one common mistake that I also see is that I'll have funders in meetings sometimes say to a client, so I noticed that in your proposal you say your mission is such and such, but I looked at your website and your mission says that it's this other thing. And so can you please explain that? What is your mission actually? And so that's just a warning that funders look at websites now and they look at them fairly closely sometimes. And so you want what's in your proposal to match what's on your website if you're going to be putting a website on there. The summary, so usually I'll I'll write this last, and this is sort of a throwaway section for some people, and just make sure that it's not a throwaway section for you. This is super, super important because there's lots of funders who they will read the summary and then they'll decide if they're going to read the rest of the proposal. And so a funding decision could be made entirely on this one section in some cases. If they don't find it compelling, or if they don't think it really matches what they're doing, then they might put it into a different pile of rejections or ones that are maybes if they don't see, that other proposals they're going to read through do the trick. So, so you want to write that last, and you want to make sure that it's really brief. Usually it's no more than a third to a half of a page at most. And one way that I do it is I kind of go through every other section of the proposal, and I make sure that I have the most important piece from each section at least considered as a part of the summary. And I'll often start talking about a need. And so I see an awful lot of summaries that start out, we're the ABC organization and we were founded in 1953 and we're based in Avery County and so forth and so on. Usually they know all that information from other things that you're attaching, and it doesn't get you right into what the request is. And so I'll often start with the problem, so for instance, the first sentence might be something like here in Avery County, in this particular community that our organization serves, unemployment is twice as high as in the rest of the community. So it might be something like that, but it's a sentence that should immediately grab the person who's reading it, sort of like the first page of a newspaper article. You could do that for practice, is look at a good newspaper, and see what their first sentence looks like. And it's usually going to be a sentence that immediately gets your attention and makes you want to read on to see, what the rest of the story is here, and what the solution and what the conclusion of this story is going to be. You shouldn't have to exaggerate. I often tell people that write on my team that, don't use a lot of adjectives or flowery language or adverbs or anything. Just use facts. And if the facts are not very exciting, then you have to dig deeper, most likely. You're probably not talking about the most compelling part of the problem that you're trying to solve. You want you want your case to be strong enough that you don't have to use any kind of exaggeration to compel the funder. And most funders can recognize that a mile away because they read like 100 proposals a day in some cases. And so, they're going to recognize something that's really true and heartfelt. And they're going to really respond to that much better than if you're using words like unique or the best or, something like that. You want to actually, it's sort of like a show, don't tell sort of thing. If you're not sure whether it's sounding interesting enough, a good trick is to read it out loud or look in the mirror and read it or something. I know my writing always sounds so boring to me when I read it. It makes it very easy to cut things out that I'm afraid to cut otherwise when I read it out loud, because I realize sometimes how long it takes me to come to the point. So organization and project background. So usually you want to set the stage. I see a lot of proposals where people jump right into here's what we want. And it's too soon, because first they really have to understand who are you, who's applying, who is this organization? And usually this is a question that's sort of separate from the project. It's oftentimes before they even ask about the project. But whether they ask it or not, you want to make sure that you've got basics about the organization, and is there anything else that the people reading this need to know? So for instance, in Western North Carolina, sometimes people don't understand why in the winter it can take 45 minutes to drive from point A to point B, because they might be reading this in a large city or something, that doesn't have really narrow roads and dirt roads and doesn't have roads that can be closed off because of rock slides. And so there's some context sometimes that you have to provide, just depending on who you're applying to and so forth. We've talked about the needs already, but just a couple other things about when you're actually writing the needs statement. Usually what I'll do is I'll put each sort of thesis statement, each of the most important pieces of description about the need in a single sentence. And then after that, I'll go back and under this one bolded or italicized sentence, I'll put the details. And then that way, if the funder, if this is news to the person in the foundation, then they can read all the fine points. And if it's not, they can kind of just say, yes, I understand. I know that this community is very impoverished, and they can just move on to the next paragraph. You want to give information that is really focusing on who you're serving. And so, for instance, if you're writing about child obesity, don't just say 1/3 of all the kids in the United States are obese, because everybody knows that, and that doesn't tell the funder anything about the problem in your community. So they want to know things like, at these particular elementary schools, the obesity rate is higher than the national rate or higher than the county rate or something like that. So if you can make it local in any way, then that's what you want to do there. So we've talked about goals and objectives, and these are just some other examples for you. I won't go into that further, but again, outcomes is the key. You want to be able to measurably show by the end of the project the quantifiable and the qualitative. So you want to be able to say, here's how many people we're serving or how many of a service we're providing, and then here is how people's lives are qualitatively going to be better. And so you need both of those pieces and not just one of those. The two longest parts of a grant proposal are the needs section and the project methods. Most often, those take the longest often to explain. And the methods is basically walking people through. So at this point, you said what the problem is. Usually you should have already said, here's what's going to happen during the proposal in terms of just a few brief bullet points of here's the objectives and here's the outcomes that we're aiming for. And then what your job in the methods section is to explain enough about how you're going to make that happen so that the reviewers will get it and they'll understand what you're trying to do and they'll understand your project. And so I mentioned here the flowchart method to sort of go through the project. And what I mean by that is just that you sort of want to start at the top of your flowchart with, step one, and then you can follow a person who's going through your project each step of the way and say, first we've got to check for eligibility. And if they are eligible, then they continue. And if they're not eligible, then maybe they get a referral to this other partner. And then once we do the eligibility check, then we enroll them in this course and so on. And so you just want to take the funder basically through it. And also you want to mention any key partners as you're going through. So, if you're referring that person who's not eligible to another organization, for instance, then you might want to mention, and we refer them to this other partner organization to show that you're working with other organizations and you've got an awareness of what's happening in the organization. You also want to say why you're the organization to do it by describing the personnel. And so this is a place where you can really sort of tout your own experience or experience of others in your organization. And if you're hiring a new person, you can basically say, we're going to make sure that this person has certain years of experience or has a certain degree or whatever it is. Jeanette, I want to just be cognizant of questions. So I'm not sure if there's any that have come through, but I just thought
Yeah,
I'd pause.
there are two questions in here.
Okay, great.
The first one is, if your proposal should be rejected the first time that you submit it, should you elaborately rewrite it for the next grant season or just tweak it and reapply?
Yeah, great question. So if your application is not accepted, if it's possible, you want to call the foundation and say, why did this get rejected? And you want to learn from that any way you can. And if it's a well-written proposal, a lot of times they'll say, you know, it's just a very competitive round and there were others that stood out. But if it's a really helpful program officer, a lot of times they'll give you some examples of what came up as an issue. And a lot of times those are things that you can address and that you can learn from. And so you definitely want to ask about that. And you want to do, before you reapply, even if you can't have that organization, you want to just be evaluating, is it worthwhile to reapply? Do we really believe we're a good enough fit? And anyone that you can talk to at the funder to try to figure that out will be helpful. And usually when I'm doing a follow-up call like that, I'll often end it with, should I really sincerely apply again? Is it really worthwhile for us to do this? Or you really think that we have a shot, you know, if it's a well done application and so forth. And so, you know, I try to get a sense of, is it really worthwhile to go back? If you're a close match with that foundation, usually it is.
Great.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry.
You ready? The second question is, how do you approach including all of these important pieces when a grant gives you limited space, characters or pages, and then how do you assess whether you've included what you need?
Yeah, so very good question. So I assess whether I've included what I need by going through some of these questions that I'm going through right now, you know, in what you should have in each section, and have I really gotten enough solid information to answer that question directly and to answer it as well as I can. And so in terms of the space question, you know, that's a very common problem, of course, is that sometimes you don't have a lot of room. So you basically want to scale your answers accordingly. And so you always want to have, for instance, your outcomes in there. And so if you don't have a lot of words, it just tells you that they don't need a great level of detail. So you don't want to be cutting out. So for instance, if you have 5 outcomes and there's not a lot of room, you don't just want to put one outcome and say a lot about it. You know, you want to have all 5 outcomes and just say less about each one. And so you want to sort of scale your answers in that way. Hopefully that answers it. Yeah, and keep editing until you can squeeze in as much as you can and still have it sound intelligible. Jeanette, are there any others at this point?
Nope, not at this point.
Okay, thanks for keeping the questions coming. Let's see, I think I just didn't say anything about evaluation there. So, so on the evaluation, these are the common questions that they'll ask. So by the time you get to this section, you probably already asked this question of yourself, is the outcome measurable? But they want the level of detail. Again, you know, the more space you have to write, the more detail they probably want. But they usually want to know for evaluation, who is doing the measuring? You know, so is it your executive director? Is it a project manager? Or, you know, who is it, so that they know that someone's responsible? And what are you used to measure and track this? So for instance, do you use surveys to measure what's happening? Do you use the achievement of certain milestones to measure? And are you tracking it in an Excel sheet, or do you have this amazing database that, you know, is made to track this sort of information? And there's not necessarily a wrong answer there. You're basically just trying to explain to them that you've thought through this and that you have a system in place to do what you need to do on this project. They usually want to know how often you're doing measurements and what will be measured and when. So for instance, we're gonna measure, we're gonna check in with this person who is looking for a job once every 3 months or once every week or whatever it is that you're doing, so that if you're taking measurements, that you're able to explain that. And I have this down here. I didn't go through the whole spiel about this sort of made up example here, but it's this group that they grow produce. And just a reminder that what you're measuring is the reduction in hunger. You're measuring if people's lives are better. You're not just counting. So it's not a complete evaluation if you say, we wanted to serve 45 people and we serve 52. That's part of the story, but the bigger part of the story is, and out of these 52 people, 45% have higher paying jobs, or 45% have lower blood sugar, or whatever it is that you're trying to measure. And you don't have to tie yourself in knots to measure it. So don't make the job too hard on yourself. Make sure that you're saying something that your measurement is, that you'll be able to really tell sincerely if they made progress, but it doesn't have to be so detailed that you drive yourself into the grave trying to track it all the time. Sustainability. So most funders, just in a nutshell here, most funders, grant funders, they want to know that you're not going to go back to them forever. They want to know that you understand that this is a 1 or 2 or 3 time thing, and then you're on your own and you're going to have to maintain the project. And so sometimes this is a very easy section. Like if you're just buying a piece of equipment or a vehicle that's going to last a long time, you can basically just say, we're going to cover the maintenance, and sometimes it's harder, like if it's if there's services that are provided. So basically you have to just put your best plan forward here, and say, we're going to be building up our donor base during the 2 or 3 years that we're starting this project, and by the end of the 3 years, we're expecting that we're going to have more diverse forms of revenue to support this. And you might not be certain about that, but they still want to see that you understand that you're not going to just rely on grant funding going forward, and that you have thought through how might we keep this project afloat. The budget, we've got not a lot of time this morning, and I could say so much about the budgets, but just, again, some things in a nutshell. So this is another area that the AMY Foundation has stressed that, that is really where a lot of grant proposals they've received have gone wrong. And so some things that, that I remember Nora mentioned to me about that, you want to make sure that your budget matches your narrative is one important thing. And so for instance, if in your budget, you're saying that 75% of the grant's going to a project director's salary, but you haven't really mentioned the project director in the whole project proposal, then that's a problem. You've got to rectify that. So you don't have to mention every single thing in the budget and the narrative, but you want to make sure that after reading that narrative, they're going to look at the budget and say, oh, okay, I see how this works. They said they're going to do teaching, and they've got money in here to contract teachers, and they say that they're going to provide food, and they show in here that they've got a certain amount of food that's donated, or that they're purchasing the food. So make sure that everything you need is in there. And if you've got volunteers, then go to a site called independentsector.org. It's independentsector.org. And if you search their site for volunteers, for value of volunteer time, there's a search box on there. If you look for value of volunteer time, it will tell you what volunteers are worth an hour, and you can actually build that into your budget. And so for instance, if you're a small grassroots organization, and you have, quite a small budget, you can show them that you are more substantial than is shown just on your balance sheet, because you've got all these committed people who are investing in your organization. So you want to give yourself credit in your budget for any of that in-kind information. And if you Google in-kind, it will explain more about that if you have not, if that's a newer term to you. Usually on a project budget, it should be on one page, and it should be written so that it's very transparent. And so, for instance, you don't want to have a line item that says funding for job training class, because that doesn't really tell you what's being paid for. You want to, say, here's how much this person's salary is, and we're paying $5,000 for the books and for the materials and things like that. And so you want to be very clear. And typically, most funders, they're looking for a budget that balances. So they're looking for the income and expenses to be equal. And if there's anything in there like money that you're saving for a rainy day or something, then you still need a line item in there that says it's going toward a reserve fund, or it's going to be reinvested back into the project or something. But typically they want to see in the budget, even though they know that actuality is going to be different, they want to see that you've accounted that you have the income planned out that's going to address all of those expenses. So that's sort of my whirlwind tour there of the proposal structure. In terms of the grant writing process, make sure that you're reading all of the guidelines. There's nothing that will make a program officer more angry than calling them and asking them questions that they took time to write out in the guidelines. And so you want to make sure that you read all the instructions before you make that call, and that you sort of write out any questions or things that you didn't understand. I'll often, so that they know that I really did read the guidelines, I'll often refer back to it and say, I know in the guidelines you said that you don't provide general operating support, but is it okay if I write my rent into this project as a project expense? So, so just make sure that you read those first. If it's a very complicated grant, or if you're feeling like you just are overwhelmed by all the pieces of it, then I've included in the handouts you're going to get a to-do list. And so you can basically make it a little timeline for yourself, and just say, okay, we've got 3 weeks. The first week I need to get these 3 things done, and the next week I need to do this, and then the following week. But I've never in my whole career regretted planning out a proposal. It always saves time, and there's lots of things that usually you realize you need to do earlier rather than later. I always say, make sure that you first address anything that's beyond your control. And so, for instance, the first day that you read the guidelines, if you see that you need a profit and loss statement, that's the day that you email your bookkeeper or whoever it is, if it's not you, and say, hey, I need this in 2 weeks. Will you please get this ready? It's when you start talking to partners that if you see that you need support letters, you might not send them the letter on the first page, because you might not, on the first day, because you might not know what you're applying for yet. But, maybe give your partners a heads up that, this is coming, and can you block off some time for me next week or something like that. So, so I always try to sort of take care of those pieces first that I have the least control over, that rely on other people. And I also try to answer the big questions first, because those are usually the ones that choose you to not pursue a grant rather than pursue it. If there's these big questions like, are we eligible truly to go for this? Or, are we a good fit, or are we not a good fit, before you start getting into all the details of it. So a few closing thoughts. So In terms of identifying grant makers, I just gave you a little bit of background on, that's a question I know that's a question many people have, is how do I find who to go to? And so there's databases out there where you can search for funders. If you don't have the $1,500 or so that it can cost to rent a foundation database, then there are free foundation databases at various libraries in the state, and I've got a link there where you can find the one that's closest to you. I did a search on Avery County, and the Catawba County Library, which is 50 miles away, was actually the closest one, so you're a little bit ways away. But you can go to this library and you can spend a couple hours looking for funders using this database. And there's usually great people there who can teach you how to use the database and how to do some searching for funders. And so if you haven't done that yet and you don't know who to ask, then that's something you should plan to do. In terms of cultivation, so, again, just be very careful who you're asking. You want to make sure that they've given grants to people who look like you, basically. And, I don't mean literally, but groups that they're doing the same work that you're doing. So if you're doing housing, go to the funder that's already given some grants to people who do housing. And when you do this research, you can, that's what the research tells you, is you can look at examples of grants that have been given. I mentioned earlier about stewardship and evaluation. So you want to make sure that once you do get a grant that you're managing it well, because hopefully, these folks, you want them to give you more grants in the future. I also just have a little bit in here about reporting. You want to put that on your calendar when you get the grant to make sure that you're going to submit the report on time and provide successes, but also lessons learned. I mentioned about sustainability, so I'm going to skim through here and go to our last slide. So some helpful links for later. There's, in case you don't have the exact AMY Foundation grants page, I put that on there. Nonprofit Pathways, who helped to put this training together, as Jeanette mentioned, they have resources, so you can look there. And again, we're going to share these shortly, so you'll have these to be able to click on or copy and paste. And then if you're looking for prospects, this is your first stop. Is the second bullet, is there's a good list of funders that have given to Western North Carolina on that website. There's also a site I included here that talks about measuring results. And then if you're wondering about fundraising during COVID-19, then you can go to this links page that I set up. And my only advice really in terms of how grant writing is different under COVID-19 is, if your work might be affected by COVID-19 and you're writing a proposal, just basically at least have a line or two in there that says, if we're still locked down, here's what we're going to do, and just provide an alternative for that. So that's the presentation. I know we're right at 11:30, so I'm sorry I cut it pretty close there, but I wanted to pack in as much as I could. But if you have any questions and we have a moment or two, I could answer those. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me via my website at communicationmark.com, and I'd be happy to, if you want to email me or something, to answer some other questions.
Mark, there is a question in the chat. That's a really good question. So I'll go ahead and read it for you here. It's from Robert. Does every application have to feel original, knowing that there may be individuals who are serving on more than one funder review committee? Or can some of the information be transferred from one application to another?
Yeah, it definitely does not have to be original, but you don't want it to feel cut and pasted. And it's a hard thing to explain, but when you read something that's only cut and pasted and not edited, it sort of stands out. And so you want to make sure that your proposals are consistent with one another. So because funders talk to each other. So if you're proposing the same thing to 3 funders, you know, if they ask you to disclose who else you're going to, you want to make sure you're consistent about saying that. But yes, it's totally fine to cut and paste your organization history or things like that. But in most cases, just realize that most foundation applications are just a little bit different, right? And so make sure that you're really answering that foundation's question and that you're tweaking the language so that it really addresses it. So for instance, some applications might say, tell us about your organization history. And then another application might say, tell us your 3 top accomplishments as an organization. And so however they ask it, you want to make sure that you're very carefully responding to that question.
Great.
Any other questions that have come in, Jeanette, that you want to?
No, but I do have another one that I hear often that I'd like to throw out and hear your response to, since we have just a minute. How do you handle a program? Let's say the program is going to cost $20,000. And I know that if I apply to 3 foundations, I may get 1 of those proposals. Do I go ahead and apply to all 3 of the foundations? And then what happens if I get funded from all of them?
Yeah. So if you get funded by all of them, then you're one of the lucky few, you know, because usually that doesn't happen. But what I do is I sort of weigh the odds. And so if I think that I need to send 1 application or 2 applications and I'm likely to get what I need, then I'll just send those 1 or 2 applications. But if I feel like some of the applications that I'm sending, it's more of an outside chance, then then I'll send more applications. It's always better to ask for the money because you can always turn it down. There's no rule saying you have to accept the grant once it's given to you. And the other thing that is not broadcast, but I found to be true, is that most foundations do not want to take money back. It's like there's certain math that they have to do to make sure that they meet their tax requirements and things like that. And it's a whole process that they would need to go to, to go through to reallocate those grants and things like that. And so usually what happens when you get a grant from more than one source is that what you want to do is go back and say, here's something that's as similar as possible that we want to spend the money on. So in other words, you might say, we were going to serve 20 people, but what we like to do is expand this now that we have 2 grants to serve 40 people. So you want to have at least 1 or 2 scenarios that you can pitch to the foundation that are reasonable responses that say, here's what happened. If you want us to give the money back, we will. But what we like to propose is that we use it in this other way that still meets the same sort of goal. You want to see jobs created. We're proposing this other thing that creates jobs, and it's just a little bit different than what we proposed before, but it's still, solving that same sort of aim that your foundation has. And 95% of the time, they're going to say, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions out there?
Thanks everybody for sitting through. It's hard to listen to anybody talk for this long, and so thank you. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me. My email it's mark@communicationmark.com, Mark with a K. And so feel free to email me, or there's other contact information on information about what we do on my website.
Great, and I'm going to add into the chat right now the link for our survey. And so hopefully that'll that'll show up as a hot link and everybody can just click it and go do the survey. Otherwise, we will put it in the email that's coming out. And then I also wanted to say that a follow-up workshop to this one is a financial reporting workshop that's going to be happening on June 23rd, and you should have received an invitation to that already. If not, there'll also be a link in the email that you receive. But it's a good workshop and for when you receive a grant and you're ready to report back to the foundation, or when you're looking at providing financial reports to your board. So that's a wonderful workshop with Wade Rogers coming up. And then I also just want to point out that on the AMY Wellness Foundation website, there's a video from Nora walking through the grant proposal. So there may be questions that you have as you're filling out the proposal that you can take a look at that video and she'll answer for you. And also she's very accessible in terms of asking her questions, and she wants to help all of us to submit successful grant proposals. So thank you all very much. Please do that survey, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.